It was supposed to be the proudest day of my life, my daughter's graduation. But as the champagne flowed and the cameras clicked, my wife stood up and detonated a bomb in front of everyone. She wasn't just leaving me for her 28-year-old intern. She'd already emptied our accounts and bought a beachfront condo with my retirement fund. But what she didn't know, the sun broke through the Texas sky like a promise as Thomas Caldwell stood beneath the arches of Southern Methodist University, watching his daughter Maya walk across the stage in her navy blue gown. She looked radiant, confident, grounded, the embodiment of everything he'd hoped she would become. Thomas, a 52-year-old forensic auditor from Dallas, felt the weight of the last 20 years ease off his shoulders, if only for a moment. He'd sacrificed late nights, missed holidays, and taken on clients no one else would touch, all to make sure Maya had every opportunity he never did. And now, as her name was called and applause filled the air, it all felt worth it. The reception afterward was held at a private rooftop venue downtown, filled with soft jazz, laughter, and clinking champagne glasses. Friends, family, and colleagues gathered around to celebrate Maya's achievement. Thomas stood near the balcony, proudly introducing her to anyone who hadn't yet his girl. But amid the joy, something felt off. Elaine, his wife of 26 years, was uncharacteristically quiet, her eyes flicking to her phone more than to Maya. She excused herself multiple times to check on work, though Thomas knew there weren't any open listings that day. Jake, her intern, hovered close. Too close. His laugh too casual for a professional setting. Still, Thomas pushed the discomfort aside. He didn't want to cloud Maya's moment. Not today. This was supposed to be a milestone, a symbol of everything they'd built as a family. But deep down, he couldn't shake the creeping feeling in his gut. Something was coming, and in hindsight, part of him knew the celebration was just the calm before a very public, very personal storm. A storm that would make him question everything and everyone. Mom barely had time to refill his glass before Elaine tapped her spoon against the rim of a champagne flute, drawing the crowd's attention. The rooftop buzz faded into an expectant hush. She smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was rehearsed. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate Maya's incredible achievement," she began, her voice steady, eyes scanning the room like a performer hitting her marks. Thomas stood beside Maya, watching her mother with a strange tightness in his chest. Then Elaine took a breath and dropped the bomb. "I also wanted to share some personal news. Jake and I are starting a new life together." Gasps rippled through the crowd like a domino effect. Maya froze. Thomas blinked, certain he'd misheard. Elaine pressed on, oblivious, or amused, to the shock around her. "We've fallen in love. I know it's sudden, but it's real. And we've already made arrangements. We'll be relocating to Florida next week." Jake, standing off to the side, gave a sheepish wave as whispers ignited across the venue. Elaine turned toward Thomas now, the mask slipping into a private account. "We need a clean start." For a moment, no one moved. The silence was so heavy it threatened to crush the rooftop. Thomas looked at Maya, who stood motionless, her graduation cap still on, her eyes wide and stunned. Elaine expected chaos. She expected tears, maybe even begging. But instead, she was met with something far more unnerving. Thomas's quiet, controlled stare. He didn't yell. He didn't reach for her. He simply set down his glass, because while Elaine had chosen this day to light everything on fire, she had no idea that Thomas had already smelled the smoke, and he hadn't come to this party unarmed. In the hours that followed Elaine's announcement, Thomas found himself replaying the past 6 months like pieces of a puzzle he should have solved sooner. There were silent, red ones, now that he looked back with clarity. The late-night showings that never appeared on her agency's calendar. The spike in untraceable ATM withdrawals always just under the threshold that would have triggered automatic fraud alerts. The new passwords on her devices. The subtle way Jake, initially just an unpaid intern tagging along for real estate tours, had gradually begun accompanying her everywhere. Even to family dinners under flimsy professional excuses. "He's eager to learn," Elaine would say, brushing off Thomas's raised eyebrows. "Young talent needs mentorship." He had trusted her. Or maybe, more honestly, he had chosen the comfort of denial. It wasn't that he hadn't noticed. It was that noticing would have forced him to confront what he wasn't ready to accept. That the woman he'd built a life with might already be building something else behind his back. The tipping point came 3 months ago, when he logged into their joint account to transfer funds for Maya's tuition and saw a $17,800, 0 cents wire transfer labeled client staging deposit. There had been no staging, no client. That moment, quiet but seismic, changed everything. Thomas didn't confront Elaine, not then. Instead, he opened a private folder on his work laptop titled View. He began cross-checking transaction logs. He quietly ran forensic software on their shared devices. His background in auditing had trained him to spot anomalies in thousands of lines of data. What chance did Elaine stand when he finally looked closely? As the evidence stacked up, flight itineraries, hotel charges, unregistered property viewings in Sarasota, he realized that Elaine hadn't just been drifting, she'd been plotting. And now, standing in the wreckage of her reveal, he knew one thing. She wasn't the only one who'd been preparing for a dramatic exit. While Elaine had been orchestrating her affair in broad daylight, Thomas had been working quietly in the shadows, piecing together what would become his counterstrike. In his line of work, collecting evidence wasn't emotional. It was tactical. Facts, timelines, money trails. That was his world. And now, it was her trap. He enlisted the help of Richard Evans, his longtime friend and cybersecurity consultant, to recover deleted emails, encrypted messages, and GPS data from a shared cloud account Elaine had forgotten he still had access to. The findings were damning. Correspondence between her and Jake stretched back further than she admitted. Vacation planning, photos, even real estate inquiries under pseudonym. Thomas built out a digital timeline using software he normally reserved for fraud investigations. He matched each suspicious transaction with hotel stays, gift receipts, and rental car bills. Every piece was time-stamped, cataloged, and cross-referencing. The extra $100 only came from a former student at UNG. It was transferred to a Shell LLC linked to a Sarasota condo Jake had inquired about on Zillow. Another $9.50 went to a luxury jewelry retailer in Miami. Elaine had never worn anything from there, but he'd seen the earrings on Jake's mother's Instagram last Christmas. The case folder was thick by the end of April. Not just a stack of papers, but a war chest. He'd even consulted Deidre Marks, a seasoned family and financial attorney, under the guise of updating his estate plan. She'd taken one look at the evidence and said, "This isn't just grounds for divorce. This is financial misconduct, bordering on criminal." Thomas had remained calm through it all, anchoring himself in process and precision. He didn't want revenge, he wanted clarity. And now, standing on the edge of his wife's betrayal gone public, he felt no panic. Just purpose. Because she had no idea the man she was betraying had built a career turning paper trails into justice. And this time, the trail led right to her. Elaine barely had time to bask in her moment of manufactured liberation before Tomas stepped forward, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the stunned silence surrounding them. With steady hands, he reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a thick, manila envelope. Clean, crisp, and heavy with consequences. "Before you two head off to paradise," he said, his voice even and cutting through the tension like a scalpel, "there's something you should probably read." He handed the envelope to Elaine, who hesitated, visibly thrown by the shift in energy. Jake shifted nervously beside her. Maya watched in stunned silence, her expression unreadable. Elaine opened the envelope with a frown, pulling out the first page, a notarized notice of divorce proceedings already filed. The second, a court-ordered freeze on all jointly held assets. Then came the spreadsheets. Detailed logs of every suspicious financial transaction she had attempted to bury. Her face paled with each line her eyes scanned. The cherry on top? A printed email from her brokerage's compliance department, where a formal complaint had been submitted regarding misuse of business funds. Attached were time-stamped surveillance photos. Her and Jake holding hands during a client showing, a bottle of champagne in hand. "You may want to read page 12, Thomas added softly. "That one outlines how I legally reclaimed the deed to our home last month, when you skipped that notary appointment and told me to just sign for you." Jake's face twisted into a confused snarl, but Thomas didn't even look at him. All his attention was on Elaine, whose hands were trembling now. "You were planning your escape," he continued, "but I built the road out from under you." Gasps echoed. A few guests who had remained politely frozen now whispered behind flutes of champagne. Thomas didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood tall, hands clasped in front of him, as his wife's perfect little getaway unraveled, page by page. Receipt. The rooftop that had once buzzed with celebratory joy now simmered with stunned silence and secondhand shame. Elaine stood frozen, her carefully curated confidence crumbling in real time. She clutched the envelope like it might bite her. Jake, no longer the smug intern with a glass of rosé and a dream, looked as if he was calculating the cost of his next flight home. But it was Maya who broke the spell. "You chose today for this?" she said, her voice low but razor-sharp. "My graduation? My moment?" Her words sliced through the air, sharper than any legal document Thomas could have filed. Elaine tried to speak, something about timing and truth and following her heart, but no one was listening, not anymore. Guests were already collecting their coats, whispering as they passed, shaking heads with sympathy aimed squarely at Thomas and Maya. A few old friends of Thomas's gave him knowing nods, subtle acknowledgments of a dignity rarely seen in moments of betrayal. Jake reached for Elaine's elbow. "We should go," he muttered, eyes darting toward the elevator. But Thomas wasn't finished. "One last thing," he said, pulling a smaller document from his jacket. "The Sarasota condo? That deposit was made with laundered funds. The Department of Real Estate's already been notified. Jake, you might want to talk to a lawyer of your own." Elaine's jaw fell open. Jake took a step back. "You reported me?" he hissed. "You don't even know me." "No," Thomas replied, "but I know enough." It was a clean unraveling. There were no tears, no screaming matches, just the quiet, devastating precision of a man who had done his homework. Elaine and Jake turned and left in silence, their exit awkward and unceremonious. Thomas didn't watch them go. Instead, he turned to Maya and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "This is still your day," he said softly. And while the world around them reeled, Thomas stood in the center of the wreckage, not as a victim, but as a man who had already begun to rebuild. By the time Elaine and Jake reached the elevator, their faces flushed with humiliation, Thomas stepped forward with a final document. Thin, but lethal. "You might want to take this too," he said, handing it to Elaine with the calm authority of someone who no longer owed her an explanation. "It's the finalized quitclaim deed. I had the house refinanced and transferred into my name 2 months ago." Elaine's eyes scanned the page as if hoping it would rewrite itself. "You signed it, remember? You told me to just handle it while you were busy staging that luxury condo in Sarasota?" Her face drained of color. Jake scoffed. "You can't just take the house. That's not legal." Thomas finally looked at him. Really looked at him. "Son, I audit multi-million-dollar fraud cases for a living. Trust me, everything I've done is legal. What you two have done, however..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Elaine's hand went to her throat as realization settled in. She had no assets, no liquidity, and no plan B. The beachfront condo's deposit was frozen. Her brokerage license was under review. Even her name had been quietly removed from the family trust last quarter. An update she hadn't noticed in the flurry of her secret planning. Jake turned to her, face twisted. "You said everything was covered. You said we were secure." Elaine opened her mouth, but no words came. Thomas stepped closer, but his voice remained low, steady. "You promised me a lifetime, Elaine. And when that became inconvenient, you promised him a future. With my money. But you forgot one thing." He paused, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. "I don't play to lose." That was it. The final blow. Not shouted, not thrown, just laid bare like every other receipt, signature, and detail he had lined up in his arsenal. And as the elevator doors slid shut on two people who thought they were escaping, Thomas stood in the quiet aftermath, his dignity intact, and the balance finally reset. The elevator doors closed with a metallic thud, and just like that, Elaine and Jake vanished from the rooftop and from the world Thomas had spent decades building. What lingered was a silence more powerful than applause, a silence that confirmed to everyone present that this wasn't just a scandal. It was a reckoning. Thomas didn't bask in it. He didn't gloat. He simply exhaled, the first real breath he'd taken in months. Maya stood beside him, clutching the diploma that had been overshadowed but not forgotten. Her eyes were glassy, but her voice was strong. "Let's go, Dad. I don't want to waste another second on." Downstairs, the staff began clearing plates that were never touched. A server paused beside Thomas. "Sir," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say, that was one hell of a move." Thomas managed a small smile, nodded his thanks, and turned his attention back to Maya. "This is still your day," he said again, and this time it wasn't just sentiment. It was. They left the venue with their heads held high. No scenes, no drama. Just the calm dignity of two people who had weathered something unforgivable and chosen not to let it define them. On the drive home, Maya leaned her head against the window. "Did you know all of it?" she asked softly. Thomas kept his eyes on the road. "Not at first, but I trusted my gut, and I didn't want her to destroy us without a fight." He didn't say much else that evening. He didn't have to. The weight of betrayal was still there, yes, but it was balanced now by something far stronger: closure. He poured himself a glass of scotch, sat on the back porch as the Dallas sky shifted to dusk, and felt a strange peace settle in his chest. Elaine had walked out of his life believing she'd won, but Thomas didn't measure victory in beach houses and betrayal. He measured it in the quiet that follows when justice speaks louder than rage. In the weeks that followed the rooftop ambush, Thomas found himself in unfamiliar territory. Not devastated, but redefined. The silence of his home, once shared, now felt like an open canvas instead of an echo chamber. The first step was practical. His attorney, Deirdre Marks, moved quickly. The divorce was filed, the asset freeze upheld, and a motion was granted to protect Maya's education fund from any retroactive claims. Elaine's brokerage was under investigation for ethical violations tied to her misuse of client accounts, and Jake had quietly vanished from the Dallas real estate scene. Not that Thomas was checking. He didn't need to. That chapter was closed. He took time off work, just enough to recalibrate. He deep-cleaned the house, room by room, box by box, as if shedding the residue of someone else's dreams. Maya, now living at home while job hunting, helped between interviews. Some nights they'd sit together on the porch, sharing stories they hadn't made time for in years. "You always seemed so invincible," she told him one day. "I never realized how much you were holding together." Thomas nodded, grateful for the honesty. "Neither did I." He began reconnecting with people he'd pushed to the periphery. His brother Stephen, his high school friend Mark, even his old jazz band from his early 20s. Music came back into his life like a soft echo, something he hadn't realized he'd missed until his fingers brushed the dusty keys of his old keyboard. And cooking? Elaine had always insisted on takeout. Now Tomas found therapy in learning to make the meals he used to only dream about. He started small: pasta, gumbo, French toast. But each dish felt like a reclaimed piece of himself. The betrayal hadn't broken him. It had stripped away what no longer belonged. And now, for the first time in years, Thomas wasn't managing someone else's life. He was living his own. One step at a time, one choice at a time. All forward. By the start of fall, Thomas Caldwell wasn't just rebuilding, he was evolving. What began as an act of survival had become something sturdier, something that resembled pride. The calls from law firms and financial institutions had started rolling in after word spread about how cleanly he'd dismantled the legal and financial traps laid by Elaine. He turned down most of the offers, but one piqued his interest: a leadership position at a boutique firm specializing in fraud prevention and asset protection. "We want someone who's not just book smart," the managing partner told him. "We want someone who's lived it." He accepted. Not just the job, but the idea that this next phase was his to shape. His days became a balance of mentorship, consulting, and strategy. His evenings were quieter, more intentional. Maya landed her first job at a nonprofit startup and decided to stay in Dallas, at least for now. Occasionally they'd share dinner on the back porch, a soft jazz record playing through the screen door, the same one he used to spin in his 20s before life demanded. Elaine, once the center of his world, had become a footnote, her name surfacing only in the occasional legal update or hushed industry rumor. Jake had reportedly moved out of state, and the Sarasota condo never made it past escrow. The world she tried to build on deception had collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. Thomas, on the other hand, had built something real, something earned. His home was no longer haunted by secrets, but filled with music, warmth, and the scent of whatever he was testing in the kitchen that night. The betrayal had cut deep, yes, but it had also cleared the ground. And from that cleared space, he'd poured new concrete, rewired the foundation, and built a life that was his, and his alone. This time, no one else held the blueprint. In the quiet hours after everything settled, Thomas often found himself journaling, not to relive the past, but to understand it. What Elaine did could have broken him. Once upon a time, it might have, but what he learned through it all was far more powerful than anger or revenge. He learned the difference between reacting and responding, between collapsing and reclaiming. Betrayal has a way of spotlighting who we are without the masks. And in that spotlight, Thomas discovered a truth he hadn't known he'd been missing. He was never meant to be someone else's supporting character. He'd spent decades building a life rooted in responsibility and loyalty, and while those values remained, he no longer tied them to someone else's approval. The storm hadn't just passed, it had cleared the landscape, and what remained was a man who no longer second-guessed his instincts or apologized for drawing lines. Justice, he realized, wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration, of peace, of purpose, of self. And so, every morning, as the sun rose over the Dallas skyline, Thomas didn't look back with bitterness. He looked forward with quiet confidence. Because now, the life ahead of him wasn't built on sacrifice. It was built on truth. The story of Thomas Caldwell teaches us a powerful truth. Betrayal may bruise you, but it doesn't have to break you. When his wife blindsided him on what should have been their proudest day, Thomas didn't react with fury. He responded with strategy. He didn't let emotions cloud his judgment. Instead, he leaned into his instincts, his experience, and his integrity. The lesson here isn't just about justice, it's about self-worth. Thomas didn't need to yell or seek vengeance to reclaim his dignity. He used knowledge, patience, and quiet preparation to protect what mattered most. What we take from his journey is that healing doesn't come from revenge, it comes from clarity, from drawing boundaries, from knowing when to fight and how to fight smart. Thomas built a new life not by forgetting the pain, but by learning from it. He showed that walking away isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't win someone back, it's knowing you never needed them to begin with. His story reminds us that we can rise, not despite betrayal, but because of it, stronger, sharper, and standing on a foundation we built with our own hands.